Good morning, girls. It's Wednesday of Education Week, and I really enjoyed your video. I don't remember, Sunday, I think, Johanna. It was very interesting to learn about radiology and how X-rays work and the different kinds of radiation because I sort of learnt it in biology class in like junior high, but then I sort of forgot about it. It was actually kind of interesting, and I didn't know that there were those many different kinds of rays. I feel a little bit more enlightened. And speaking of enlightenment, I really think the X-ray part was pretty interesting actually because I didn't know that was how it worked, but I do now. Maybe not so surprisingly, my part of Education Week is going to be about the brain, because that is really what my education field is pretty much all about. You know, different aspects of the brain. But I thought, at least today, I'm going to just go through the different parts of the brain and what they do and see how long that takes. And maybe next week, which I think is a good idea. Let's do more of these education videos. Then maybe I'll talk about, how things actually work inside the brain. Today I'm just going to talk about the different parts of the brain. So, without further ado, basically you've got four different lobes of the brain, or four different major parts. You've got the temporal lobes, which are right here, which are bilaterally symmetrical, so they look exactly the same on both sides. Then you've got the frontal lobe, then you've got the parietal lobe, that's on top right here, and then you've got the occipital lobe, which is right at the back of the brain. And all of these do different things, but they're all kind of interconnected because the brain isn't really just divided into separate pieces. It's actually sort of jelly-like and very well connected and melded together. So I'm just going to go through the general things about what these different parts of the brain do, because they all sort of do everything. They work together. So let's start with the frontal lobe. So basically the frontal lobe is where all your processing goes. It's all where you think. I mean, it's all your imagination and your actual thinking process. It's like, what should I think about next? That is all happening right here in the frontal lobe. It's speculated that us humans having a frontal lobe is what separates us from the animals, because the frontal lobe is basically just calculations and being able to think about things in an abstract way and just, having imagination. The voice in your head when you think is coming from the frontal lobe. And it's basically, that one fast, but the frontal lobe is basically just your processing center. It's where you think. So it's where you're actively thinking. So yeah. Okay, let's move on to let's go clockwise, so the temporal lobe. Right, the temporal lobes, which are on both sides of the head, are really they process hearing and smells, apparently. I thought I'll go through that a bit later, but I've always thought that the smells just go directly up into your brain because you have cell receptors right here. But I'll do that later, maybe next week. Today I'm just going to talk about that. Your hearing, which is on the side of your head, incidentally, goes to the temporal lobes. It's processed here. So it's like the signals get translated in the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe also has a gland called the hippocampus. I think it's a gland. It's an organ, at least, in the brain, which has a lot to do with memory, and it's like your long-term memory storage, your file compartment. So the hippocampus, which is also on the side of the brain, is basically your memory storage. And it's actually quite interesting because we've found that when you sleep, in your REM cycle, your hippocampus is actually really active. So when you sleep, you sort of process the would-be long-term memories and store them away. So we've actually learned from studying cognitive science that if you study for a test, you can't do it just in one night, because then you won't have enough memory. I mean, the hippocampus would have to work very, very hard to put everything you've learned in one day into your memory file. So just study like every day and then make sure you have a good night's sleep, or at least that you dream, because dreaming is when the side of the brain, or the temporal, the hippocampus is the most active. Yes, let's move on to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe handles your seeing and sight. You know, light coming in here through the pupillae, and then they go back to the occipital lobe. And that's it. Parietal lobe. Alright, so the parietal lobe is right up top, and that is actually second to the frontal lobe. It's my favorite lobe, because that is where all your senses, like, you know, your hearing, sight, smell, taste, and touch senses are melded together and put into useful information. So if you hear a barking dog, and if you see a dog that's barking, you see the barking dog, it goes through your eyes back to your occipital lobe, and then you hear the dog, which goes through your temporal lobes, and you know, the information goes through your ear to your temporal lobe, and then it's all sent up here where it's processed, so you both see and hear the dog at the same time. So the dog doesn't go, or you don't see the dog just standing there and you hear bark, 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 but you know, you get my point. It's synchronizing the brain. The temporal lobe, no, the parietal lobe also deals with, it's a little bit difficult, but it also kind of deals with movement, because you have your premotor cortex, which is kind of a part of the parietal lobe, but it's also a part of the frontal lobe. It's up top, almost to the back of the frontal lobe, and that is where you calculate your movement, where you do the fine print movements, like when you pick up a pencil, or several pencils in this case, and when you do this with your hands, you activate, or when you play piano, or when you write, you use this premotor cortex to do those things. Maybe I should also go through a little bit of the glands, or different organs inside the brain. You have something called the thalamus, or talamus, which is basically just like the core of the brain. It's right in the center of the brain, and that is basically where all the information goes through. It's like a circuit box. That is where the information goes through, and then it's spread out into the brain. So when you hear something, it goes into the temporal lobe, and then it goes through the thalamus, and then it goes up to the parietal lobe. If you see something, it goes through the thalamus, back to the occipital lobe, and then up here. If you smell something, it goes through the temporal lobe, and then you understand my point. And yeah, the thalamus is basically the core of your brain. Because you see, we have something called the limbic system, which is in here, right in the middle of your brain, which is sort of the reptile brain. It's the very basal things about you. Like amygdala is there, and I think the basal ganglia are there, and I'm not sure if the thalamus counts, but I think it does, because it's basically what makes your brain work. So, and that's sort of the core of the brain, and then you've just built this cortical mass around it. So all this grey matter is really not something that's supposed to be here. Or rather, the frontal lobe is something that we humans have developed a bit more than other animals. I'll go into this a bit more in depth next week, but that's basically all the lobes. You have the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe. And yeah, maybe next week I'll tell you how they work. And also I'll bring up amygdala and the basal ganglia. They are very cool actually. And I'll talk some more about transmitter substances. Yes. On a completely unrelated topic, I seem to recall Johanna mentioning maybe coming to Sweden this summer, and I was just wondering if that's going to happen or not, because I would like it if you did. So just tell me where I don't know what idiom to use here. So let's just go with, just tell me how everything is looking on the Western Front, I think. So I look forward to seeing your other education video, Johanna, and I hope that Adrian puts up another one. And puts up one, I mean. And until next week, don't forget to be awesome. I know I won't.